Dean Martin leaned back in his chair on the set of his own show, a crystal tumbler of whiskey catching the studio lights. It was October 1970, and the King of Cool was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Across from him sat Clint Eastwood, the quiet cowboy who had just returned from Italy, his face revealing nothing. "You know what, Clint?" Dean said with that famous lazy confidence. "You've been making all these westerns over in Italy. Bet you picked up some of that romantic Italian music, huh?" The studio audience chuckled. They knew what was coming. "Why don't you sing us one of those Italian love songs?" Dean continued, raising his glass. "Let's see if the man with no name has a voice to match that famous squint." The audience laughed louder. This was pure Dean Martin, taking down guests with a smile. But here's what nobody in that NBC studio knew, what Dean Martin couldn't possibly have known. Clint Eastwood had spent 3 years in Italy doing more than making movies. He had been studying, training, working with one of Rome's most respected vocal coaches. And in 4 minutes, he was about to deliver a performance so powerful that it would silence every laugh in that room and transform one of Hollywood's biggest egos into a humbled man. Before we dive into this incredible moment when quiet confidence shattered loud arrogance, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you believe real strength doesn't need to brag, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're about to show you how a cowboy taught a legend the most important lesson. This is King of Cool Legacy. Let's begin. It was a warm October evening in 1970 when cameras rolled at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. The Dean Martin Show was at the peak of its power. Every Thursday night, millions tuned in to watch Dean do what he did best: drink, joke, and make music look effortless. The set was designed like an expensive living room, all warm lighting and comfortable furniture. Dean Martin was American royalty. He had sung with Sinatra. He had commanded stages from Las Vegas to Carnegie Hall. His records had gone gold. His movies made millions, and his variety show was crushing the competition. At 53, Dean represented everything smooth about old Hollywood: the tuxedo, the cocktail, the easy charm that made audiences feel like they were watching a talented friend. But 1970 was a strange time in Hollywood. The old guard was being challenged. A new generation of actors was rising. Actors who didn't sing and dance. They were gritty, real, raw. And leading this movement was the man sitting across from Dean right now. Clint Eastwood was 39 and on fire. He had spent 6 years in Italy making westerns that changed cinema. A Fistful of Dollars, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Films where the hero didn't talk much, didn't smile much, and definitely didn't sing. Clint was the anti-Dean Martin. Where Dean sparkled and performed, Clint observed and calculated. Where Dean announced his talents, Clint kept his secrets buried. The two men on that couch represented two different Americas. Dean was the country that remembered when entertainers wore tuxedos and made everything look easy. Clint was the country tired of pretending, that wanted heroes to feel real. And tonight, these two worlds were about to collide, because Dean Martin was about to learn something that would change him forever. The quietest men sometimes carry the most powerful gifts, and the biggest mistake you can make is assuming you know someone's depth by their surface. The interview had started friendly enough. Dean asked Clint about his time in Italy, about the westerns he'd been making, about what it was like to become famous for barely speaking on screen. Clint answered in his typical style, brief, humble, with a slight smile that revealed nothing. "So you spent, what, 3 years over there?" Dean asked, swirling his drink. "About that," Clint replied. "And in all these movies you probably say, what, 10 words total?" Dean grinned at his own joke. The audience laughed with him.
"Sometimes less," Clint said calmly. Dean saw an opening. This was too easy. "Well, you must have picked up something besides that squint. What did you do over there when you weren't shooting guns?" "Learn to appreciate the culture," Clint said. The food, the language, the music. The music, Dean practically shouted, playing to the crowd. Did you hear that, folks? Our cowboy here appreciates Italian music. The audience ate it up. Dean was building to something, and everyone could feel it. You know, Dean continued, leaning forward with that predatory smile, I've been singing Italian music my whole life. My family's from Italy. I grew up with these songs. He paused for effect. But you're from California, right? You just visited Italy for a few years. That's right, Clint said, still calm, still unreadable. Dean turned to his orchestra leader. Hey, Nick, what Italian songs do we know? The orchestra leader, playing along, called out a few titles. That's Amore, Volare non Dimenticar. Non Dimenticar, Dean repeated, savoring the words. That's a beautiful song, real romantic, takes years to master. He turned back to Clint with mock innocence in his eyes. Since you love Italian music so much, why don't you give us a little sample? Come on, show these folks what you learned over there in Italy. The audience's laughter had a nervous edge now. Some people sensed this was going too far, but Dean was committed. He raised his glass. Come on, Clint, don't be shy. We're all friends here. Just a little song. For a long moment, Clint sat perfectly still. His face showed nothing. Then slowly, like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment his entire life, Clint Eastwood stood up. He looked at the orchestra leader. You know Non Dimenticar? Yes, sir, the orchestra leader said, suddenly serious. Let's do it, Clint said quietly. And Dean Martin's smile began to fade because something in Clint's voice told him he had just made a terrible mistake. Dean Martin sat back in his chair, cocktail raised, ready to enjoy the disaster he had orchestrated. In his mind, this was television gold, the tough guy cowboy trying to sing a song that Dean himself had recorded. It was perfect, it was cruel, and it was about to blow up in his face. Clint walked to the microphone with that same unhurried stride, no showmanship, no performance, just a man walking to do a job. The studio audience was silent, uncertain what they were about to witness. Everyone held their breath. The orchestra began. Soft Italian strings filled the studio. Clint closed his eyes. He wasn't performing for the audience. He wasn't even performing for Dean. He was somewhere else entirely. And then he began to sing. Non Dimenticar means don't forget. You are my darling. The first phrase hit like a physical force. This wasn't a tough guy trying to sing. This was a trained vocalist who had been hiding his gift for years. Clint's voice was a revelation, deep and rich like aged whiskey, warm like summer nights in Rome, vulnerable in a way no one had associated with the man with no name. Every Italian word was pronounced with native perfection, but it was more than technical skill. It was emotion, raw, honest, unguarded emotion from somewhere deep in his soul. The audience forgot to breathe, camera operators forgot their marks, and Dean Martin's cocktail glass slowly lowered as his smile died completely. As Clint moved through the verses, his voice gained power. Non Dimenticar, my lips have kissed your lips and held you tight. He wasn't showing off, no vocal gymnastics, no unnecessary flourishes, just pure emotional truth delivered with devastating precision. The song became about longing, about the things we hide, about the parts of ourselves we're afraid to show because the world has already decided who we are. Dean Martin was no longer smiling. His face showed shock, confusion, then something like pain. This was a professional musician watching another professional operate at the highest level. But more than that, this was a man realizing he had completely misjudged another human being, had assumed, had mocked, had tried to humiliate someone based on nothing more than arrogant certainty. The final notes hung in the air. Clint opened his eyes slowly, returning from wherever the song had taken him. He stepped back from the microphone with quiet dignity. No bow, no smile, just a cowboy who had answered a challenge. The studio was absolutely silent, and in that silence, everything changed. The silence lasted 3 full seconds, 3 seconds that felt like an eternity on live television, 3 seconds where every assumption shattered and reality reassembled itself into something nobody had expected. Then, from the back of the studio, a single person began to clap. Slow, deliberate. Then another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire studio erupted into thunderous applause. This wasn't polite applause. This wasn't the obligatory clapping that television audiences give because the applause sign lights up. This was genuine, shocked, deeply moved appreciation for something beautiful and unexpected they had just witnessed. People were standing. Some were crying openly. A woman in the third row had her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Men who had come expecting comedy were wiping their eyes. The orchestra members were looking at each other with expressions that said, "Did you know he could do that?" And nobody had. Nobody, except maybe Clint himself. But the most dramatic transformation was happening in Dean Martin. The cocktail glass sat forgotten on the side table. Dean's hands were gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. His face had gone pale beneath his famous tan. For perhaps the first time in his entire professional life, Dean Martin had absolutely nothing clever to say. No joke, no deflection, no smooth transition to the next segment. The man who had built his legendary career on never being caught off guard was sitting on his own show on national television, completely and utterly speechless.
Completely and utterly speechless. The applause continued for 20 seconds. When it finally died down, Clint returned to his seat with the same quiet composure he had shown all evening. He sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and waited patiently. No gloating, no smug satisfaction, just patience. Dean tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He tried again. "Clint, The words wouldn't form. The smooth-talking legend was fumbling for language like a nervous teenager on a first date. Finally, Dean picked up his cocktail, not to drink, but just to have something to hold. His hand was shaking slightly. "Clint," he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard on his show, "I have to tell you something. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've performed with some of the greatest singers who ever lived, and what you just did—" He paused, searching for words. "I had no idea. I thought I was setting you up. I thought—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I owe you an apology," Dean said finally. "That was extraordinary. That was real. And I was wrong about you." Clint nodded once, accepting the apology with the same grace he had shown throughout the entire evening. "We all make assumptions, Dean," he said quietly. "The important thing is what we do when we realize we were wrong." And in that moment, something beautiful happened. Two men from different worlds found respect. The rest of the show was unlike any Dean Martin show that had ever aired. Gone was the practiced comedy, the rehearsed bits, the smooth performance. Instead, two men had a real conversation. Dean asked genuine questions about Clint's time in Italy, about studying music, about keeping talents hidden, and Clint, for the first time all evening, opened up. He talked about the vocal coach in Rome who had worked with him for 3 years, about singing in small clubs where nobody knew who he was, about how music had been his private passion since childhood, something he did for himself, not for cameras or applause, about waiting for the right moment to share it. Dean listened with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew him. He shared his own journey with music, the early struggles, the times he had failed. For once, he wasn't performing, he was connecting. "You know what you taught me tonight?" Dean said as the show neared its end. "I've been so busy being Dean Martin that I forgot to look deeper at people. I saw a cowboy and assumed that was all you were, but you're an artist, a real one." When the episode aired 2 weeks later, it became one of the highest-rated shows in the program's history. The phones at NBC rang for days. Thousands of letters poured in. People weren't just talking about Clint's singing. They were talking about the transformation they had witnessed, about how Dean's humility in the face of being wrong had been as powerful as Clint's performance. Both men's careers changed after that night. Clint was offered roles that showed different dimensions of his talent. Dean, in his remaining years, became known for his curiosity about guests rather than his comedy at their expense. And both men, in later interviews, would speak of that October evening as one of the most important moments of their lives. The story of Dean Martin and Clint Eastwood on that October night in 1970 became more than entertainment history. It became a lesson that generations would reference. Film students study it, communication professors teach it, and ordinary people share it when they need a reminder about the danger of assumptions. The recording of Clint singing Non Dimenticar has been played millions of times worldwide. But the real legacy isn't in the notes he sang. It's in the transformation that followed. It's in the reminder that every person carries depths we cannot see, that quiet people often hold the most powerful gifts, that humility in the face of being wrong is more valuable than never being wrong at all. For those who witnessed it, either in the studio or at home, it became an unforgettable touchstone. A moment when they saw two Hollywood legends stripped of their personas and revealed as human beings capable of growth and change. The most powerful performances don't happen on concert stages. They happen in quiet moments, when someone chooses to respond to mockery with excellence, to judgment with grace, and to arrogance with dignity. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to look deeper at people around you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. This is King of Cool Legacy. Until next time, remember, the strongest voices often belong to the quietest souls.